Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 281 of Ben Franklin's World, a podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. We live in an age of data. Some of this data tells us about the world around us, while other data tells us about, well, it tells us about us. Governments and companies collect a lot of data about us, from what test scores we achieved in schools to what our internet searches and social media posts say about us as individuals and as consumers. We live in an age where big businesses track our shopping habits, and in some cases, our work habits. But is this age of data new? When did the age of the spreadsheet and the quantification of work habits develop? Caitlin Rosenthal is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, and a former business management consultant with McKinsey & Company. Caitlin is a scholar who seeks to answer the questions of when did big businesses start tracking individual work habits? And how did having data about these individual work habits allow them to pursue profits and act ethically, or perhaps not so ethically, towards their employees? And what Caitlin found is that the age of business data collection and scientific management based on that data collection isn't an invention of the late 19th or early 20th centuries, as scholars so often claim, but an invention of the 18th century, when plantation owners and overseers started to manage large sugar and cotton plantations worked by lots of enslaved people. Now, using details from her book, Accounting for Slavery, Masters in Management, Caitlin will help us explore the rise of quantification in business. And in that process, she reveals why we need to view slaveholder account books as business records, how slaveholder account books became standardized in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and how the standardization of slaveholder account books gave rise to spreadsheets, data, and the use of scientific management, which imposed a brutal system of surveillance over enslaved people. But first, did you know that you can find a list of complementary episodes on the show notes page for most episodes or in the episode descriptions displayed in your podcast app? About a year after I started Ben Franklin's World, I started linking episodes I was working on to other episodes in the Ben Franklin's World catalog that would help provide more information about something that was mentioned in the episode that you're listening to. It's a practice I continue to this day, which means when episodes leave you yearning for more information, all you need to do is check the list of complementary episodes to find other episodes that will help you further your knowledge about the topics we just discussed. Okay, are you ready to investigate the emergence of business data collection and the uses for that data in early America? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. She's an expert in 18th and 19th century business history, economic history, and labor history. She's also the author of numerous articles and a book, Accounting for Slavery, Masters in Management. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Caitlin Rosenthal.
It's wonderful to be here.
So, Caitlin, I wonder if we could begin our conversation with your story, because you are a historian of American business and labor history. But before you became a historian, you worked as a management consultant. So, would you tell us a bit about your business experience and how that experience has informed your work and interests as a historian?
Sure. Right out of undergrad, I went to work as a management consultant for McKinsey & Company. I was the youngest person on all of my teams, and I was a person in the basement conference room with a spreadsheet, crunching the numbers to help us give businesses recommendations what to do. And while I was doing that, I had two kind of epiphanies. One was that as I worked in a whole bunch of different industries, from trash companies to medicine to natural gas, I just realized how fundamental big businesses were to the way Americans experience their daily lives. I had known this in the abstract before, but I really hadn't thought very deeply about it as it related to my interest in history. So I got interested in business history. The second connection is really about scale. So all the businesses I was working for were really big. And I had a lot of data about a lot of people, about workers and about customers. And I didn't directly have power over their daily lives, but the information, the numbers I was crunching ended up in reports that led to big decisions that might influence whether they kept their jobs, whether they got a raise, whether a product was available to a particular market. So I became interested in big business and its relationship to quantification. Specifically, what happens when business leaders start to see people who work for them, people who they serve as customers, as cells in a spreadsheet. And so when I went back to graduate school to do history, I wanted to trace the emergence of that kind of spreadsheet outlook and ask what were the consequences for American businesses, both for the ways they pursued profit and also for their ethical behavior to their employees.
You mentioned that one of your experiences as a management consultant was that you really got to see how big businesses influenced and impacted the lives of everyday people. Were there any big businesses in early America? And if there were big businesses, how did early Americans interact with big business?
So this is one of the things that put me on the story of plantation slavery. There were merchants who did big trading, and there were textile mills that increasingly had, say, by the 1830s and 40s, might employ 400 people or something like that. Now, when you go to the British West Indies or to even some of the largest plantations in the American South, you can find plantations that are much, much larger. So, for example, I use records from a group of plantations in Jamaica. It's something like 20 different properties that range from 100 slaves to 500 slaves. In total, about 2,000 slaves, and they're all owned and managed in one organizational structure. So it's a really big business. And this would have been much bigger than other colonial big businesses.
Now, in her book, Accounting for Slavery, Caitlin explores the relationships between American slavery and American capitalism, and how American slavery and American capitalism impacted early American business practices. Specifically, Caitlin explores how slavery encouraged the development of sophisticated management practices. Caitlin, would you tell us about the relationship between slavery and capitalism, and how that history of American slavery fits within the history of American capitalism?
So coming from that management consulting environment, I was used to people thinking about their work being the heir to the legacy of Carnegies and Rockefellers, of railroads, of computers, and a telling story for the emergence of businesses and of the economy we live in today that came out of a free labor setting. And so I went back to graduate school to study the emergence of this big scale. I assumed as that was where it started. I started my research looking at records from the Lowell mills, textile mills in New England, and looking at iron forges and eventually looking at railroads. And then relatively early on, someone handed me a copy of Thomas Affleck's Plantation Record and Account Book, which was a pre-printed all-in-one plantation book designed for use on a slave plantation. And I was immediately blown away by the complexity of this record, and then also by the fact that a number of Southern planters filled it out assiduously, keeping productivity data for every enslaved person on their plantation every single day. So this changed my view of where this story started. So I started to look for milestones in business practices emerging on slave plantations. And then the project became one where I was seeking to basically write slavery back into the history of American business. The traditional narratives and topics covered by scholars in business history generally don't include or intersect with slavery. But it turns out that most fundamental innovations, from the emergence of organizational structures to the keeping of productivity to tracking depreciation of assets, were also happening on slave plantations.
That's really fascinating, and it does lead to a larger question about the relationship between American slavery and American capitalism and how that relates to the history of early America. So, could you tell us more about this relationship between American slavery and American capitalism?
Well, there's two different stories. When I say the history of capitalism, I really mean the emergence of the economy that we live in today. And the economic history of slavery, people had talked about the relationship between that economic history and the emergence of capitalism, asking, did slavery shape the emergence of capitalism, or even did slavery cause the emergence of capitalism? But a lot of that work continued to think of slavery as pre-modern, as not advanced or not innovative. And what I was seeing was slavery merging with modern capitalism and adopting many of the most sophisticated business practices of the time. So I think of detailed business practices, highly quantitative business practices, as being one of the characteristics that emerges with the arrival of modern capitalism. And seeing that emerge on slave plantations changes the way we have to talk about the relationship between slavery and capitalism.
So now that we have some context in place about the histories of slavery and capitalism, One of the unique aspects of Caitlin's work is that she focuses on the history of American slavery and American business through the account books of slaveholders. And in accounting for slavery, Caitlin notes that historians have rarely used account books and don't necessarily view them as business records. Caitlin, would you tell us about the slaveholder account books you looked at and what it means to view these account books as historical business records?
So a lot of the records that I used had been used before. People had used them to find out about the structure of enslaved families, to find out what people ate, to understand stories in social and cultural history. So that meant that very few people who'd used these records had actually asked, what do these look like in the context of other business records? That is, people who are running an enterprise as one of its main goals to make money. So I could come and look at these plantation records and ask, why are slaveholders recording the data that they're recording? Not only what are they recording, but how are they putting it to use? And sometimes how are they being thwarted when they try to record something and enslaved people simply refuse to be measured? And that's not a set of questions that people had brought to these records before. There are lots of historians of American slavery who've used account books, and there are lots of business historians who've studied business practices, but almost no one was bringing those two fields of expertise together.
You talked a bit about how you view account books in relationship to other business records. But what do account books look like in relationship to other account books? What is the physicality of an account book? Like if we were to go into an archive and ask to look at an account book, what precisely would we be looking at?
Oh, absolutely. So I'll take you through an example in a second, but I should first start by saying account book is not even really a category that makes a whole lot of sense in early America. And I know this because when I go to the archives and I request an account book that's listed in the library catalog or in a finding aid, I never know what I'm going to get. Sometimes I get a pocket-sized book that someone carried around making notations. Sometimes for a bank, for example, you get a gigantic leather-bound gold embossed book. And all of these fall under the category of account books. And some of them are filled cover to cover with neat calculations that are easy to decipher. Others are used in multiple ways in both directions. For example, account books are used from the beginning. Someone stops needing the book for that purpose, but paper is scarce, so later when they need another book, they simply flip it over and begin again from the back. And then because these are historical account books, a lot of them are scribbled over by children as they kind of continue their life in an environment where paper was relatively scarce. So the category of account book is a pretty broad one that basically includes any kind of notation people are making. So I had to narrow down a little bit. So the book is really about account books that relate to the management of labor. And I mentioned one of those earlier in your questions, Thomas Affleck's Plantation Record and Account Book. And this was basically a desktop book about the size of 8.5 by 11, a little bit bigger. And the book contained about 15 different blank forms. Some of them, it just had one copy. Some of them, it had enough copies to, say, for example, cover the entire picking season. And a planter was instructed in a set of instructions up front that they were to fill in every different form, and they could tally up each different form. And then entries from each of the forms would all go and become inputs into the final form, which was a balance sheet. And then they could tally that balance sheet up, and they would know something about how profitable their work was. So it was a kind of Mad Libs for accounting. Now, as you can imagine, not everybody filled out the whole book. Indeed, a lot of people didn't fill out most of the book. So what I do is I kind of go in and look at what people did fill out, what they skipped, how they changed the way they were filling things out over time, what numbers they added up, and how they might have used them. So in that account book I just described, the most important two forms for cotton plantations, number one, the record of cotton picking, where planters filled in how much cotton every enslaved person picked every single day for the picking season. They tallied that up both by person and by week, and they used it to track their productivity. So they could set incentives, make comparisons, and simply know if they were on track for the year. The other most important and almost always completed record is an inventory of enslaved people. It's basically a record of what we would call human capital. How much were these human assets worth? Typically, these have a list of names, a list of ages. Sometimes they include occupation, and then they have an estimate of the person's value in the market. And at the beginning and the end of the year, planters would often tally up all these values, and they could compare to where they were a year earlier to know if their investments in enslaved lives were growing or decreasing. So basically, what these two records represent are the two main ways that planters were making money. growing as much cotton as they possibly could and increasing the value of the enslaved lives that they owned.
This is really interesting because, as you said, account books could really vary in size and contents, and I've even seen that in my own research, and there's quite a variety there. And yet, on these plantations, you really find account books that have about 15 different pre-printed forms that plantation managers or owners could fill out or not fill out as their needs dictated. Now, what I'm curious about is how these pre-printed forms, like the cotton picking sheets or the inventory sheets, how these pre-printed forms developed and how these forms changed over time as more and more plantation owners used them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's most striking about the Plantation South is that the records are standardized compared to what you find in the North. And there's two different ways to think about how those records emerged. There's like a long story and a short story. So the particular book that I just described, it's the bestseller Plantation Account Book, is written by a man named Thomas Affleck, who's an immigrant from Scotland. He moves to the US and he has worked previously for a bank in Scotland, so he has some financial expertise. He brings that with him. And as he starts to plant cotton in the American South, he looks at the records of his neighbors and sees that he thinks there would be a market for a pre-printed account book. And he sees this himself as a kind of business opportunity. He's an investor who's always speculating in new things. So he has these books printed up, specialized for sugar and for cotton, and in varying sizes to accommodate varying plantations. So his story and the way he describes it when he's trying to sell the book is a very personal one, where he's brought this special expertise. But if you take a couple of steps back, the story of how account books come to be so standardized in the American South actually begins quite a bit earlier, and probably in the British West Indies. So there, going back to as early as around 1790, you can find a less complex, but still quite detailed, pre-printed all-in-one plantation record and account book. And more common than that are monthly reports that absentee owners in England had printed up, and they would require the attorneys and overseers to fill these things out every month and send them back to England so that they could monitor their plantations from a distance. And there's at least some evidence, including someone who migrates from Jamaica to the United States and then publishes a series of articles in a Southern periodical, that some of the American books that emerge, like Thomas Affleck, are drawing on this earlier West Indian legacy.
What was the purpose of standardizing all these different forms? How did early Americans come to decide that if you're a plantation owner, these are the things that you really need to keep track of on your plantation?
I'll give you an example of someone who adopted Thomas Affleck's plantation record and account book. Eli Capel is a medium-sized planter in the Deep South. He's growing cotton. And in the late 1840s, he's still using those smaller blank books that I described before. Basically, he keeps his plantation records in a diary where he records lots of information. And among that information is some picking totals. On days when enslaved people have picked a lot of cotton, he records each person's picking data. But he has a lot of trouble doing this. I mean, he's trying to keep a lot of data, and it spills into the margins. It's difficult to add up, and it makes a bit of a mess. So he gets a copy of Thomas Affleck's plantation record and account book, and all of a sudden, he's got a spot for every name, a column for each person, and he can enter the data that he was already collecting, but in this neat grid, and he knows how much each person is picking each day and how much he can expect to pick over the course of the week. Now, why would you want to know this information? The biggest determinant of how much money you're going to make as a cotton planter is how much cotton you can pick. And there's a bottleneck when the picking season comes. So you really need to pick quickly. And in order to pick quickly, you need to be able to figure out how much cotton enslaved people can pick. And so by keeping this data, he knows how much each person has picked in the past, how much they've picked in total, and he's able to track that information over time. Now, there are also a number of slave narratives that say that planters used this data to create incentives and punishment for enslaved people, including a couple of narratives that say planters were weighing enslaved people's cotton down to the pound, and if they fell short of their target, they might be whipped as much as a lash for every pound they fell short. And there are also planters who played overages. They set a quota for someone, and then if they reached that quota, they could be paid a small amount for each pound they went over. Now, this situation created a huge amount of anxiety for enslaved people. There's a really moving passage in Solomon Northup's slave narrative where he talks about what it was like to be an enslaved person having your cotton weighed. And he said, you approach the gin house and you're afraid whether you fall short because you'll be punished, but also if you've exceeded your target. Because if you've exceeded your target, then your target's likely to be raised in the future. So basically, planters are able to use these books to keep detailed surveillance over people to figure out what maximum amount of cotton they can expect them to pick and to push them to achieve that maximum.
Yeah, wow. It really does sound like these account books could induce a lot of anxiety, in that the planters use these account books to help resolve their anxieties about how they can make their business as profitable as possible, while they also produced anxieties in enslaved workers who now had every bit of work that they did tracked, which could really have implications for the future of their work.
In a sense, you could think about them, to borrow the terms of labor history, as a tool for a speed up on the factory line. Planters are figuring out how fast they can turn up the speed so that enslaved people are picking quickly at a high cost to them, but at the highest level where they can continue to make them keep going over time.
Now, as we heard about Caitlin's book, Accounting for Slavery, a little earlier, we discovered that Caitlin focuses specifically on the business practices of sugar and cotton plantations. Caitlin, why did you choose to focus your research on cotton and sugar plantations? What can these different plantation styles reveal about early American business practices, and what do sugar and cotton plantations reveal about these business practices that we simply can't see in, say, the business of planting tobacco, rice, or coffee?
The easy answer is that as I discovered how big this topic was, the project was just getting incredibly unwieldy. And if you're going to write about big businesses, then sugar is the biggest, and cotton is very big as well, and it's the biggest. So I picked them because they're the biggest businesses. So that's the short answer. The more complex answer, though, is that they give two very different windows into what Southern management was like. So as I mentioned before, for a cotton plantation, basically you want to grow as much cotton as possible. And the key thing that planters can do is to change the variety of cotton they're growing and tweak the fertilizer. And then when they've got that ideal match, to get enslaved people to pick as quickly as possible. And cotton is unique in that it's weighable on a per person basis. So if you're running a sugar plantation or a rice plantation, you can't easily attribute output to one person. And cotton, you can have not only weights per person, but relatively frequent weights per person. There's an enslaved picker named Charles Thompson who was in charge of weighing the cotton, and he says that they weighed the cotton 3 times per day for each enslaved person. And cotton has this attribute of being weighable per person, which means that you can analyze productivity on a per person basis. So if you're thinking about the history of slavery and the history of business, measurement of productivity on a per person level happens relatively late in the history of business. People don't usually describe it emerging until the late 19th and early 20th century with the arrival of scientific management that's trying to incentivize kind of work on a per person basis. So what happens in cotton is really distinctive. I'm not an expert in coffee, but I have been told that coffee also shares this characteristic and has some of the same records as a result. Now, by comparison, sugar is more about running a complex operation. Sugar plantations are famously described as factories in the field because you have the sugar being rolled and the juice extracted and boiled down right on the farm. It's not like cotton, which is ginned and then shipped to a distant factory. A lot of the refining process is done on the plantation. That means you need a lot of different occupations on the plantation, a lot of different skills. So where a slave plantation that's growing cotton in the U.S. South might only have a few different skilled categories of enslaved people, I've seen sugar plantations that have as many as 20 or 25 different occupational categories, ranging from watchmen and people described as rat catchers because they had to keep rodents under control from spoiling the sugar, to the highly skilled positions like blacksmiths, coopers, boilers, and distillers. And to run a sugar plantation and be successful, it's not about pushing up the pace of labor of any one person. It's about keeping the whole complex operation running. So one of the things I do in the book for sugar plantations is to reconstruct the organizational hierarchy. And you can use planters' inventories and implied reporting relationships to basically draw what looks like a modern organizational chart. And this modern organizational chart, which starts at the top with the planter and the attorney and the overseer, then goes down to white bookkeepers, and then below them to enslaved headmen, and then finally down to field hands. This complex hierarchy was necessary to keep this really complex organization going. And This looks, rather than the emergence of scientific management, kind of like the emergence of the railroads in the American South, where you have really complex logistical organizations that need this complex structure to keep running.
You've mentioned a couple of times now how sugar and cotton plantations were really the big businesses of their day in the late 18th through mid-19th centuries. Could you tell us more about the down-on-the-ground details of how these large plantations worked and about the different kinds of management systems that plantation owners really had to have in place to keep these large plantations going?
Absolutely. I'll start with sugar because I was just starting to describe the hierarchy on a sugar plantation. And we're not even going to talk about a single plantation here. We'll talk about a plantation complex. So one of the sets of plantations I write about in the British West Indies is owned by a British absentee owner, Henry Dawkins. He doesn't live on the plantation, but he requires detailed reporting from each of his different plantations. He owns a whole bunch of different properties, ranging from a few slaves all the way up to, say, 500 slaves. And altogether, the operation is 2,000 or so enslaved people in one parish, and then he also owns more enslaved people in another parish in Jamaica. And this would have been bigger than just about anything in the U.S. at the time. So at the top of that hierarchy is an attorney who is responsible for selling cotton and then also for managing relationships between the absentee owner and what's happening on the ground. Now, below him is an overseer. The overseer is the top officer resident on any plantation. So this is a free person, and he's responsible for the 500 people below him in the organizational hierarchy. Then below him, we have another set of free workers who are called bookkeepers. Now, they're called bookkeepers because they did keep a lot of records. I mean, that was one of the epiphanies I found in my research, was that records are really important to running an information system on these large plantations. At the same time, bookkeeper was a very rosy description for what we did. There is one quip from a bookkeeper who went to Jamaica. It's not a very glamorous job. He says, we come expecting to keep books and we end up having to keep hogs. And these bookkeepers would manage the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the plantation. And below them are the head people. So there's a head watchman who's helping keep surveillance. There's a head driver who's managing a series of drivers, and the drivers are themselves head people. So they manage the planting and the tending of the cane, and then they manage the cutting of the cane, which extends over quite a long period of time. And once the cane is cut, it's fed into a grinder, which extracts the juice, and the juice is boiled down into denser and denser concentrations of sugar until finally you get a solid sugar product. And then some of these plantations are also distilling rum in the same place. This means that someone who's running a plantation has just huge investments in capital. The biggest are probably in the enslaved people that are living on the plantation and also on the land. But also they have a lot of machinery. The grinding apparatus and the boiling house are very valuable. And along this process, there's a whole bunch of different bottlenecks. You have to keep the boiler running. You have to keep the cane coming. And all of it's time sensitive. So in order to make the whole thing run and to produce sugar, you have quite a complex operation. And so to make that keep happening, you have a series of detailed records, some of which are kept at each level of the organization. There's a Jamaican planter's guide who says one of the most important things is to make sure that information gets reported up from enslaved people to the bookkeepers, from the bookkeepers to the overseers. And at each stage, the information is kind of summarized down. Things are added up in total. And then finally, you end up with this monthly report that gets shipped across the Atlantic so that an owner in England can keep tabs on what's happening in his property.
You mentioned a few different people whose work contributed to plantation management, including the one bookkeeper who said that his job wasn't all that glamorous because he also had to keep the hogs. How would someone who aspired to manage a plantation have acquired all the training and experience they would have needed to have the management skills and do all the paperwork to run a plantation?
So this is to a great extent on-the-job training. And these jobs are appealing because the training is seen as itself a kind of opportunity to learn a trade and potentially move up. So a young British apprentice, probably if they can get a good apprenticeship in a counting house in London or Bristol, would take that instead. But if you can't get that, then being willing to go to the West Indies is your alternative. It means that you're going to a place that's a horrible disease environment. It's not very pleasant to be. But on the other hand, if you get there, you learn on the job and survive, then you'll be able to move up the hierarchy. And it's not uncommon for bookkeepers to become overseers over time. And once you've achieved the rank of overseer, it's still a difficult job, but you're in charge of a plantation of hundreds of enslaved people and your living conditions are pretty good. There is one interesting example of someone who's starting a business college in London in the 1850s. And I only have the prospectuses for this business college. I don't think it actually came into being. But this business college is especially targeted to the sons of American planters because he thinks they're going to be sent back to England to learn this business expertise. So it's an interesting two-way educational story where planters send their sons to England to take courses or to urban areas in the United States. And at the same time, young sons from England and New England are being sent to places like the West Indies so they can do this on-the-job training on the plantation. There's also lots of books that tell people how to do this. And I've seen copies of books that are given to young men as they're about to go work in the West Indies. So if you're going to work in the West Indies, somebody could give you a manual on how to do plantation bookkeeping and you'd take it with you. But that would only get you so far. A lot of it is on-the-job training.
You know, as you're talking, I really find the timing of the development of professionalized plantation management to be really interesting because we are talking about the mid-19th century, and that's when the institution of slavery was really starting to crumble and become abolished throughout the British Empire and eventually in the United States.
One of the things that jumps out of these records, I guess I just said it jumps out of them, but it also doesn't jump out of them. So you have these very neat spreadsheets that are sent across the Atlantic that are consulted by absentee owners, and they don't really reveal a lot of the horrors of the system. But at the same time, there are a few examples of abolitionists getting their hands on these records. And by sifting through the data, they're able to reconstruct, for example, the death and sickness rates on the plantation and show how horrifying things were that were going on. So it's a really interesting story where this high level of quantification, on the one hand, just looks like an ordinary business and makes it really easy for absentee owners to overlook the violence on their plantations. But this same sets of records in different hands can be used to create arguments against slavery.
We have been talking a lot about data in our conversation, and when we talk about business today, we tend to talk a lot about data too. And there even seems to be some concern in modern-day business owners that they allow data to control all of the decisions about their business when they really should allow other factors in their business to dictate decisions. Was this a problem in early America too, where plantation owners or managers would become so focused on the data in their spreadsheets that they really forgot to be human and therefore further dehumanize the enslaved people who were working on these plantations?
Yeah, I think some of this offers a kind of cautionary tale about how data can make it really easier to overlook some of the human costs of production. I mean, this is a case where you could get a report of plantation production, and unless you're asking the right questions of the report, you miss everything about the violence of the plantation and the horrors of the system. I mean, this is not something that is just an anachronistic thing where we look at the records and we see that they're horrifying, but actually there are abolitionists at the time who talk about this. There's a really powerful passage in one abolitionist, I can't remember who wrote it, but he says, I'm really worried that bookkeepers and apprentices are just going to get used to toting up human lives. And if they tally up these human lives day after day, they're going to become inured to the real horrors of the system because all they see is the data, and this is going to desensitize them to the broader moral questions.
Now, I'd like for us to return to the idea of scientific management because in your book, Accounting for Slavery, you argue that scientific management is thought of as a 20th century invention, and yet we can really see this style of management when we look at the late 18th and early 19th century and look at plantation management. So, would you tell us more about scientific management and how we can see it in practice on early American plantations?
Absolutely. So my book is both a book about how business was done on slave plantations, and it's also a book about how we talk about business today and kind of how we narrate the emergence of modern business practices. And when you talk about the emergence of modern business practices, there's nothing more important than scientific management. So Frederick Winslow Taylor founds what's called the system of scientific management between the 1880s and then, I believe, 1913 when he publishes his book, The Principles of Scientific Management. And in that book, he lays out that he's going to find the one best way and show a method for finding the one best way to do any factory task. And that's going to allow the same number of workers to produce more work with less time. And he proposes that that will be used to increase people's profits, And he says it's going to be used to also raise workers' wages, although workers protest mightily when scientific management is implemented in their factories. So this is dated to around 1880 to 1910. And the reason that I talk about it is twofold. One is that this is the touch point for people studying management today. Like if you go read Harvard Business Review, you find references to Frederick Winslow Taylor as the father of modern management practices. And the second reason is that what he's doing looks a whole lot like what, in particular, the cotton planters are doing. Cotton planters don't call this scientific management, but they are similarly obsessed with finding out the one best way for pushing people to pick as much cotton as possible. And the things that they do to extract this information are very similar. They pay attention to how people move through the fields. They pay attention to how much people eat. And then they make assiduous records and they report their findings in the Southern Agricultural Press. They compare their notes, and then they attempt to implement best practices to ratchet up the pace of labor.
We've certainly talked a lot about cotton and sugar plantations and how they're managed, and about all the different data that plantation managers would have collected so that they could better manage plantations. And right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I'd like for us to explore how plantation management in the late 18th and early 19th centuries compares with another development in the 19th century United States, the industrialization of the Northeast, where it also seems like factory managers were trying to manage their factories and control the output of their factory products. From our conversation with Caitlin, I think we can tell that the desire to track data about people and revenue is not something new to our 21st or even the previous 20th century. It seems to be a practice that dates back to at least the 18th century. And of course, as a 21st century podcast about early America, we collect data about Ben Franklin's world too. Broadly speaking, we can see that episodes of Ben Franklin's world reach people all around the world. Plus, the Omohundro Institute and I know from your emails that many educators from kindergarten through graduate school use episodes of the podcast in their teaching and in their classrooms. We love knowing that our work makes well-researched information about early American history available to so many different people, which is why the Omohundro Institute and I are committed to producing this podcast, so we can continue to help people like yourself discover and learn more about history and the early American past. Now, just because we're committed to this podcast and to producing great episodes doesn't mean we don't need your help with it. In fact, we could really use your help to keep our work going. This is why we created the Ben Franklin's World subscription program. This program, which you can find at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, asks you to help support our work at $5.99 per month or $60 per year. In exchange for that support, we're offering subscribers a monthly bonus episode and ad-free versions of each new episode going forward. Now, one of the questions you've asked about the subscription program is, will everyone need to become a subscriber to receive new episodes? The answer is no. We will still release new episodes into the feed every other Tuesday like clockwork. However, if you can help support us, it would be really great to welcome you as one of our subscribers. Your financial and moral support really means a lot to us, and it allows us to continue our work to make this podcast and to make it available to everyone who wants to access it. So please become a subscriber, join our subscription program at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, and help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. Please join us at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Caitlin, would you talk to us about the idea of scientific management on sugar and cotton plantations and how that management would have compared with the management practices deployed in early American factories?
So the biggest thing that jumps out when you compare the records of, say, a plantation from 1830, 1840 and a New England textile mill of around the same time period is how many workers in New England are quitting. So there are New England managers who are attempting to measure output on a per person basis. And they lay out a nice grid in their account books. They don't generally have these pre-printed standardized books like Thomas Affleck recommended, but they might have a hand-lined book that has everybody's name and the days of the week, and they try to record their output. And what's most striking about those records is how often they fail to fill them out. And that's because so many people are quitting. The turnover rate in New England factories was often 100% per year, and sometimes it could be 200% per year. And when your workers are quitting all the time like that, it's very difficult to shift your attention to productivity, to increasing output per worker. Instead, your obsession is, how can I keep the factory going? Like, how can I simply keep my operation running? And you're not even able to get to those questions of per person labor productivity. And so the circumstances of slavery radically simplify this for slaveholders. They don't have to recruit labor. They don't have to entice labor to stay. If they want to change what enslaved people are doing, they do have to, of course, negotiate, because enslaved people did have some power to resist and to shape work processes. But the extent to which that shapes what they can do is so much less. And by contrast, in New England, even when you're talking about young women going to work in the Lowell mills, people are quitting all the time, and they simply refuse to be subject to the same strictures that planters are able to use on the plantation. Now, this is all changed by the late 19th century and the early 20th century because there's much less availability of labor, so turnover is less.
Yeah, there really would have been a big difference between factories and plantations in that the ability of workers in factories to be able to quit their jobs if they didn't like them must have really thrown a big wrench into how factory managers were able to use or not use ideas and techniques from plantation management. And of course, that is the biggest difference that we're talking about here between factories and plantations, in that if factory workers did hate their job, they could quit. But enslaved people, they weren't really allowed to quit.
Yeah, and especially early on, before scientific management has really taken off, one of the key characteristics of the early American economy is that there's a lot of land and not a lot of labor. And that gives workers options. And enslaved people just didn't have those same options.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were really two important forms in that Affleck account book that we've been talking about. The one form was about productivity. It was a productivity tracker, which tracked how much cotton or sugar an enslaved person could pick. And the second important form was a sheet that allowed managers to keep track of just how much their human capital was worth. Could you talk to us about this second form? How did plantation owners and managers assign value to enslaved workers, and why was assigning enslaved person a value so important?
These are basically inventories, and they're labeled like this. Thomas Affleck's main competitor calls this form the Inventory of Negroes. And the form has a list of spaces for names, ages, occupations, and values. Then you tally up the values and you compare them at the end of the year to the beginning of the year. And you see whether the amount of value you have invested in enslaved people has increased or decreased. And this is because enslaved people were often the most important part of someone's portfolio of assets. I mean, they're thinking about them simultaneously as a source of labor to grow cotton every year, and as almost like the modern investor would think of a stock portfolio. So tracking the increase in their value helps you to know overall how your wealth is changing over time. Now, often planters didn't sell enslaved people from year to year, and they didn't plan to sell these assets. But keeping track of this information let them know that they could sell people if they needed to stay in business. And also, it meant that they could use enslaved people as collateral to get a loan if they wanted to expand their business.
Caitlin, as you think back on all the research you've conducted, what do you think we gain when we look at the history of American slavery with a business perspective? Could you tell us what adding a business perspective to the history of slavery can add to our knowledge about the early American past?
I think it's impossible to understand what enslaved people were up against unless you understand the history of American business practices. Some of the best research on the history of slavery for the last 25, 30 years has been about enslaved people's resistance and showing the multiple ways that enslaved people are able to push against the system of slavery. And it's impossible to really understand the stakes of that resistance unless you also understand the ways that slavery was modernizing and the ways that slavery was using not just violence, but also information and data to keep surveillance over enslaved people and to maintain control. And I'll just give you one example. This is from the slave narrative of Israel Campbell. Campbell's working on a cotton plantation, and he's repeatedly falling short of his target for picking cotton. So he knows that he'll be punished. As he says, a whipping will be sure. And what he does to get out of this is to stuff melons in his bag of cotton. He sneaks them in and he achieves his weighing target. And then later he sneaks them out of the bag so that they won't be detected. But because the planter is keeping detailed records, the end of the season comes and the cotton is all being ginned. And there's a number called the turnout ratio, which is if you picked X amounts of not yet cleaned dirty cotton, after it's ginned, it should mean X amount of ginned cotton. And the planter does that calculation after the cotton has been ginned, and he knows that someone has either been stealing cotton or has been hiding stuff in the cotton. So he uncovers the deception. And because of this, Campbell has to stop this practice and risk punishment. So, like the kind of constraints that information and data create in enslaved people's daily lives are combined with the threat of violence to create a system that's getting stronger even as enslaved people are resisting it all the time. And unless we understand the ways that slavery used data, it's impossible to see that full picture of what enslaved people were up against.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if historians in the past had included studies of slavery and plantation management in their early histories of American business? How do you think the history of slavery and the history of business would look different today?
I think that's a really cool question. And even before the Civil War happens, both sides of the debate are pushing against this narrative. Southern planters are saying, oh, no, we weren't that profitable. And abolitionists who want to get rid of the system are also saying, oh, slavery isn't that profitable. So everybody's talking about how slavery isn't the kind of business that it actually is, which is one that was often very profitable and used quite advanced practices. So everybody is changing the narrative from the very beginning. But what if instead we had recognized slavery for what it was, both a social and cultural institution, but also always a business, one that was highly calculating and one that was often very profitable? So one thing that I think would have been amazing is that if American business had had to reckon with the history of slavery earlier. One of the things that's happening in research right now is there are scholars working on, say, the insurance industry, uncovering how modern insurance companies like New York Life all offered slave insurance policies. Similarly, there's a scholar working on Brooks Brothers, the clothing company, and Brooks Brothers was involved in slavery. So there's kind of people retracing company histories to uncover their complicity in slavery. And if this had happened 50 or 100 or immediately after the Civil War, we might have a very different national relationship to the institution of slavery. Business history, for example, is really strong in Germany, in part because after the Holocaust, individual businesses were forced to reckon with the ways they were complicit with the violence of the Holocaust. And if we had a legacy of American businesses reckoning with their connections to slavery, I think we would have both a bigger and different understanding of how slavery worked. And then we'd also have a different conversation about reparations. It would be much more concrete, much more specific. Maybe there would be individual businesses that would be taking the lead on reparations. And maybe we're still going to head that way. But I think understanding how central this was to the emergence of American businesses has a potential to transform how we talk about reparations. And if we'd been doing it for 150 years, that conversation would already look really different.
Now, what aspect of business history are you researching and writing about now?
So I have two projects. One is continuing to work on the history of slavery. I mentioned earlier that one of the skilled positions on a slave plantation is the watchman. So I have a project trying to uncover the role of enslaved watchmen in the British West Indies, in particular because these are elderly or injured slaves, and they're put to work as watchmen often because they can't do anything else. But the job of the watchman is also a potentially dangerous one because you have to trust an enslaved person to be your eyes and ears and to keep watch over other slaves. And it was a potentially even a subversive position where enslaved people could use this position against their masters. So I'm trying to study what it took for planters to extract this labor of surveillance from enslaved people. So that's one project. And then the other project that I'm just kicking off is about the more modern history of American business. In particular, I'm interested in the emergence of human relations departments and how they evolved over time, which includes the fact that a lot of women make a lot of progress in human relations, but even as women are climbing the corporate ladder in HR is becoming a de-skilled back office type of function and becoming less prestigious. And this project, I think I'm hoping to get to the story of why human relations departments have become more concerned with legal liability in many cases than they are with actually creating good work environments. And, even though it's a very different time and place, it really has grown out of my interest in how data and numbers shape the way businesses see their employees and shape the way they see workplaces and their potential to shape people's daily lives.
And Caitlin, how can we get in contact with you if we have more questions about plantations and business history in early America?
I have a website that's just my name, CaitlinRosenthal.com, or my Berkeley faculty website. And both of them have my contact information, so you can reach out with questions.
Caitlin Rosenthal, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the accounting practices for slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was really fascinating.
It's been a wonderful conversation.
The history of American slavery goes hand in hand with the history of American business practices. As Caitlin revealed, the biggest businesses of early America relied on enslaved labor and data collection to determine how they can make their businesses more profitable. This is why looking upon slaveholder account books as business records is so important. As Caitlin mentioned, many scholars have looked at account books to find information about enslaved people, information about how many enslaved people worked on a particular plantation, or personal details about those enslaved people, like how old they were or what job they performed on a plantation. But when we also look at these account books as business records, we can see the constraints the information contained in those account books, such as pick cotton weights, placed on enslaved people. Knowing about these constraints helps us better understand not just how enslaved people pushed against the system of slavery, but also what was at stake in their actions of resistance. And knowing about these constraints not only helps us better understand how enslaved people pushed against the system of slavery, but also what was at stake in their actions of resistance. As Caitlin described for us, slaveholder account books reveal the ways in which slavery was modernizing over the course of the 19th century. And that modernization not only meant more violence towards enslaved people, but also a lot more surveillance when it came to how enslaved people worked and lived. Collectively, the data and information contained in account books allows us to see how the system of American slavery grew stronger and more oppressive, even as enslaved people resisted their enslavement all the time. What are the consequences of collecting data about employees? What can this data mean both in terms of how businesses pursue profits and their ethical behavior toward employees? Caitlin showed us that asking these questions of the past can yield fascinating information about the development of American business and American society. Look for more information about Caitlin, her book, Accounting for Slavery, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/281. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. And if you'd like to help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears, please become a subscriber by joining the Ben Franklin's World subscription program, which you can do by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, if asking questions like, what does data collection about employees mean for how businesses pursue profits and ethical behavior towards employees, can yield fascinating information about the past, what do you think asking these same questions can tell us about our data-minded present-day society? I'm curious what you think, so let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.